Hi there. You've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about what I watched not too long ago is a dialogue between Dr. Josh Bowen, who also calls himself Digital Hammurabi, and Aron, who is an internet atheist aficionado. And so actually both are atheist or agnostic. I'm not sure exactly which position Josh holds, but he is an expert in ancient Near Eastern literature, I believe, or ancient Near Eastern information like the Assyrians. He has focused on that. He has a PhD in that area. And so he likes to do a lot of commentary on the Old Testament. And so I actually went and listened to him talking to Aron about certain passages in the Old Testament. So let me rewind a little bit. Not too long ago, I was a doubting Christian. I had spent about 20 years believing that Jesus might not have resurrected. I was very weak in the faith. I was looking for God, but I was looking in all the wrong places. So I was looking in the Eastern faiths, and I was very curious. I did a lot of reading. I read a lot on different Eastern faiths and different ideas with that. And I thought that that was superior to Christianity. I thought Christianity was sort of the default religion. And then I found myself on a plane next to a pastor, and the pastor said to me, he asked me a lot of things. We started talking about the adult C.S. Lewis books and other things, but he also said, who is this? Who am I describing? And so I'm going to read a verse to you. And if you don't know this verse, just think carefully about who this verse could be describing, okay? Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we punished him, punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Think carefully on who that might be describing. Well, the pastor on the plane read that verse to me, and I immediately shouted out, Jesus Christ. Of course that's Jesus Christ. It's a complete description. And if you read the rest of the passage, you're going to see it even gets better. But beyond that, so I was listening to Dr. Josh Bowen again in his reflections on Isaiah 53. He also mentions here Daniel 9, and he mentions Psalm 22. So we're going to listen to him speak about those particular verses. Those are among 330 Old Testament prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Those are some of the strongest ones that Jesus fulfilled. I mean, the strongest prophecies, most positive indications of Jesus, less ambiguous than some of the other passages. There's also, of course, things like Zechariah 9:9, in case you're not aware, where they speak of Jesus on the donkey when he rode into Israel. That was prophesied. Isaiah 53 was written about 700 years before Jesus walked the earth, and Psalm 22 was written by King David about 1,000 years before Jesus walked the earth. So these two came well in advance, and so many people have tried to figure out ways to refute them when they doubt or deny Christianity. So when they do that, they will figure out ways to refute them. So a common way that people use to try to refute Isaiah 53 is to claim that it is the country, it represents the country or people of Israel. But of course, that isn't to say Israel bore our sins. Is that likely? Is Israel not beautiful? Israel has many beautiful parts. It says here, he had no beauty or majesty. It's referred to here in the it also is referring to him, and he was despised by mankind. He was a man of suffering. So this is clearly not referring to the nation of Israel. So it's a very strange assertion that many people, including Jewish people, try to fall back on. So let's listen to what Dr. Bowen has to say.
And there was a discussion about who the servant is. Now,
let me preface this. He is talking about Mike Winger. So he's referring to a video that he had listened to that Mike Winger made as a refutation of Aron Ra's video that was on Tyre. So it's a really great video that Mike Winger did. I will actually link it in the description, and so you can watch it. It's very interesting, very well studied. So Dr. Bowen is trying to basically say that Mike Winger has some invalid points. So here we go.
Now, this is a place where I think everybody's got to come to the realization that this is one of those places where the text is it's clear and it's not, right? And the interpretations of those passages of the four servant songs, they're many and varied, right? This he makes the argument that the servant in Isaiah 52:13, 53:12, I'll just call it Isaiah 53, that servant is Israel is a very late, it's a very modern idea. I mean, it's simply not true. So, the second century Septuagint reading argues it goes to great lengths to translate the servants, particularly the servant in Isaiah 53, as
we are
Israel.
Talking about the passage where we're describing Israel as a people, right? As a collective. That's supposed to be the suffering servant.
That's correct. So there were several things here that kind of jumped out at me, and I was going to go into great detail about the text, but I think that might be boring. But there are two things that I think stand out. Number one, modern scholarship, the consensus scholarship here is that Cyrus is the servant in chapter 42. That the I think remaining 8 references, I can't remember. Actually wrote it down here. Yeah, the 12 other uses in 40 to 48 refer to Israel and Jacob. The servant is the nation of Israel. And then when you come to Isaiah 53, I think that deutero Isaiah, right, the guy that we think probably penned second Isaiah here, is acting as a representative of the nation, right? And I don't think there's any real problem with that, because this is all part of apocalyptic messianic genre, right? This is what they do. There's this, if you read through the book of Daniel, for example, I mean, you see this, this concept of suffering that has to take place, unjustifiable suffering that has to take place, because this is being born out of their suffering during the second century. Right? I mean, this is directly related to this. And they pick up on these themes. So I don't think there's any problem in seeing if we want to talk about authorial intent, seeing Isaiah 53 as an individual, probably deutero Isaiah himself, the guy writing this thing, acting as the not.
So what he's saying right here is deutero Isaiah, who's writing it, is referring to himself as having bore the sins, bore our transgressions. Does this make sense to you? Does the nation of Israel, does that make sense to you, that the nation of Israel would bear our sins? Is a nation of Israel without sin? Also note that he had done no sin. So we have another point that refutes Dr. Bowen's issues. Now, I have a little surprise for you, in case you're wondering. I am going to have clips in just a little bit from Dr. Michael Brown, who is an expert in ancient Near Eastern literature. He's very well known. He's a former Jewish person. Now he's a Christian. He's a Jewish Christian, or Jews for Jesus. He's basically in that camp. He's been researching this for decades. He's phenomenal. Dr. Josh actually was just on a show with him not too long ago on the Modern Day Debate, and the two of them agreed on a number of points, which is fascinating. So they agreed on a lot of the context of the ancient Near East. They agreed with respect to some of the slavery issues that we see in the Bible. So the two of them came to a lot of agreement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you clips from Dr. Brown in just a little bit that will refute many of the points that Dr. Bowen is making here. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to mention, he referenced Daniel 9. it will interest you to go to Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27. In previous videos, I've documented a lot of the different ways that those passages speak to the dating of Jesus' crucifixion. They also speak to the fact that Jesus, the Anointed One, would appear in the Second Temple. Now, the Second Temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in the year 70 AD by the Romans, and that was also portended by Daniel the prophet. So it's quite fascinating. I've also made references in other videos about how Daniel, as a prophet who had prophet status according to Josephus and according to Jesus and according to some of the early writings, was sort of demoted right around the time of the Talmud. And so I have documented some of the arguments on that and why they demoted Daniel. And of course, it's because Daniel has such amazing prophecies. But let's go back.
Him writing it, but probably his followers later writing it about him because he died. But representing Israel as a whole, right? So in that sense, you can see how, a late first century, early second century author could come back to this and say, "Oh my gosh, this is messianic," because it's part of the messianic milieu.
So I'm going to go back and reference the verse that he had pointed out. So he had pointed to Isaiah 52:13. Here's what it says. Now you think if this sounds like the nation of Israel. See, my servant. I'm sorry. I have a funny face on Josh. I got to change his face.
It's part of this.
Okay, that's better. Sorry, Josh, if you're watching this. Okay, so see my servant. Sorry. See my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted. Okay, I'm serious now. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being. Okay, again, human being. Does this sound like the nation of Israel? And his form marred beyond human likeness. Again, the nation of Israel, human likeness. And he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. So let's go back.
Messianic idea. But seeing with specificity this idea, for example, I guess we can probably talk about that. That's going to be too detailed. But I think that he makes the statement that Jesus, the passage doesn't say that Jesus, that the servant was beaten by God, right? And he says, no, we accounted him as smitten by God, as beaten by God. Well, verse 6 and verse 10 clearly say that God is the one. He's the agent doing the smiting. He's the one doing the crushing.
So let's look at what verse 53:6 and verse 10 say. Verse 6 says, we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Does that sound like the Lord went down himself and just started beating him up? I don't think so. Also, let's look at verse 10. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Let's go back. Does this sound like it was the Lord's will that he be crushed, but the Lord didn't physically crush him himself? Let's continue.
There are particulars about this that I think he just gets wrong, but it's in defense of a position that I don't think he needs to have. I don't think the way that the New Testament authors use Old Testament prophecy often doesn't line up with their Old Testament contexts, and they were okay with that. It wasn't a problem for them because that type of usage in the New Testament's fine. They have different concepts about keeping things. We would have a problem taking something out of context, right? That wasn't necessarily the case for them. So, like, moving on to, and I know I'm moving quickly, and I'm sorry about that.
That's quite all right. But if I could interject, but
sure.
It might take things out of order. I mean, there was the reference to, I think it was King David talking about how he's being hunted by hounds. He's got, people are bringing their dogs out to chase him down, and there's a line in there where, depending on your translation, it could say piercing your hands and feet. If you're being hunted by dogs and they're snapping at you, how is that a reference to Jesus? Obviously, the guy got his hand bit by a dog. That's what I'm reading.
So, the Psalms are obviously very, very poetic, very metaphorical. And David is describing, the psalmist is describing despair that he's feeling. I mean, this is what they do in the Psalms. So metaphor is, it's just huge. The problem with that passage is that verb that you just talked about, that form, the piercing. There's an article here that the Journal of Biblical Literature that in 2004 by Kristen Swenson, and it's just one that you can peruse. She does a pretty good job summarizing all of the different ways that scholars have tried to. That verb doesn't make sense in the context to pierce, right? It's weird. It's a verb. There's a very common Hebrew verb to pierce. And by the way, when it says pierce, it doesn't mean to of course, when we think of pierce, we think pierce, the hands, right? But if you read the uses of the word pierce, and again, it's this other very common verb, it means to kill somebody, right? To drive something through them, to stab them, to kill them.
Through or something along those lines? Stab?
Yeah, to stab. That's right. So she goes through, so Mike Winger takes this and says, well, it's very clear in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they translate this as pierced. Well, the versions are actually very divided, extremely divided. When you look at the Old Greek, when you look at the later redactions, when you look at the Targums, it's not clear at all. And
so remember this. He says it's not clear at all when you look at the Targums, when you go back and you look at some of the older manuscripts. We'll check on that.
Actually, and I won't bore the listeners with all the different ways that this could be translated. But she comes down, and I think it's, it's a reasonable, it's something reasonable to say. She wants the verb just before this weird form in the Masoretic text, which reads like a lion. You referenced that in your video.
Okay, note what he just said. Take a note. He said in the Masoretic text, it reads like a lion. Let's continue.
Video. She reads the verb before it with that like a lion. So like a lion, they have surrounded my hands and my feet. And what she says here, and again, I'm not saying that this is the correct translation. What I'm trying to say is that it's very complicated. And so making a statement that it's, the Greek says it, so that must mean what it, be what it means, it's naive, unfortunately. So she says here, the word guides readers to imagine both the encircling of dogs and lions before they attack, and the condition of the psalmist paralyzed with fear and unable either to defend himself or herself or to run away. It describes both spatial circling and figurative cutting off of options. The psalmist's enemies, likened to a pack of dogs and to a lion, figuratively circle around him or her. The terror of the threat has effectively cut off the psalmist's strengths, yadai, my hands, my power, and the ability to flee, raglai, my feet. Right? So you can see that it's metaphorical, but it's like the psalmist saying, "Day and night my tears have been my food." Right? It's a type of poetic imagery that's driving home the point. So I think it's much more complicated than that. And I think trying to pigeonhole because of an interpretation that you want it to say something, because the New Testament author seems to allude to it, in Mark or in Matthew, I just think it's too simplistic of an approach.
The New Testament author didn't merely allude to it. Jesus made the statement himself on the cross. He said, quote, and this is from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? He said, he alerted us with that very first sentence, my God, why have you forsaken me, to Psalm 22. So it might bring us here to want to continue and see exactly what was said. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you, our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their head. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth, I was cast on you. From my mother's womb, you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls surround me. Strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions that tear their prey. This is clearly metaphorical. Open their mouths wide against me. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It is melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. And that's in verse 16, 22:16. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. But you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. That verse quite clearly describes the scene on the crucifix. And if you go back to the passages in all four Gospels, you can compare those with what is said in this verse about the way people divided up his clothes and how they treated him and how they mocked him. All of that is very clear. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go over to Dr. Brown to see what he has to say about this sort of thing. Hold on. So I have a video here where Dr. Brown refutes Rabbi Singer. And so in that refutation, he speaks to many of the topics that Dr. Bowen had covered. So let's go.
Actually, that's kind of a glaring, shocking statement by Rabbi Singer. Extraordinarily so, in fact. Yeah. No New Testament writer makes reference to it. Nobody? How about Jesus himself? How about Matthew 24:15? Matthew 24:15. Yeshua says, so when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, and he goes on and says, let the reader take note. This is the only time that this unique expression is used, Matthew 24 and the parallel in Mark 13, where Jesus is specifically saying, take note, look at this text, take note of this. And where is that passage? Well, the abomination of desolation is mentioned a few times in Daniel, including Daniel 9:27. So Yeshua himself is saying, look at this passage. Make sure you look at it. And it's obviously something having to do with the destruction of the temple that was going to come, and he was warning his followers about it. So he's drawing our attention to this very prophecy. Quite remarkable. Rabbi Singer says no one quotes it, no one makes reference to it. No, Jesus himself makes explicit reference to it. Now, we also know, Paul writing in Galatians 4 mentions the Messiah coming in the fullness of time, and there was a sense there are other Jewish traditions inside and outside what becomes Rabbinic Judaism that make reference to this text as well. and this is fairly well known. It doesn't you research it online and get some good academic papers that are available online that go through this and how things were looked at chronologically. But there was a sense, others others have written about it as well. There was a sense of living in this time, this fullness of time, this messianic era. In fact, from what we understand, the Essenes at Qumran had calculated things using the 70 weeks and were expecting the revelation of Messiah, which would have been, 30 or so years before, 35 years before Jesus was crucified. The point is, though, that Jesus refers to this and points to this very passage, telling us to take note. So the very thing Rabbi Singer said, it was so important somebody would have pointed to, Jesus did, and tell us to take note of it. So that's the first thing. That's big. That's very major. And by the way, I've addressed this at great length, from Rashi's commentary to current counter-missionary work, some of the very, very weakest work that's ever been done, in my view. Some of the worst and weakest arguments that have been given to Daniel 9:24-27. I've interacted candidly with folks that I think this is some of the weakest what I've seen. And even Rashi's commentary, what's he actually saying? It's somehow messianic, but future. And anyway, it really breaks down. So the Messiah had to come and accomplish his atoning work before the second temple was destroyed. And the Messiah himself pointed readers to that text in conjunction with the destruction of the temple spoken of in that very passage. As to the idea, well, why don't the apostolic fathers talk about it? How come none of them talk about it? Well, for the most part, they're not writing about messianic prophecy or proving things to Jews or other. These are pastoral letters and things like that dealing with issues, but you have within the first 2 centuries. So the early part of what others would call the Christian era, references being made to this very passage, Daniel 9:24-27. Again, I just checked to see what you can find online. Look for early Christian interpretation of Daniel's 70 weeks, and you'll find references from early on in Christian literature. Where did they get the idea? Perhaps the fact that Jesus drew attention to the passage? All right, let's go over to Psalm 22. And Rabbi Singer there is referencing Psalm 22:17 in Hebrew, 16 in some of our English translations. And should the text say, like a lion, my hands and feet, in which case Rashi says, like a lion, they mauled my hands and feet, because there's a verb missing, like a lion, my hands and feet. So they're like a lion, they're at my hands and feet, they're mauling my hands and feet, which would still work as a good description of crucifixion. Or could it be that other ancient texts and translations indicate that the correct reading is they pierced? So let's take a look at what Rabbi Singer says, clip number 3.
Before I even go into this, why isn't this quoted in the Christian Bible? That means if first century Christians believed that it's said, that means if we're lying and the first followers of Yeshua, okay, I played by the rules, believe that said they pierced my hands and my feet, you have to believe that they didn't think that was an important enough verse to quote.
Actually, very surprising again. Yeshua himself hanging on the cross, quotes from Psalm 22:1, drawing our attention to the entire psalm. That's one reason he cries it out on the cross, to draw our attention to the psalm. And then other specific instances from the Psalms, how the mockers mock him using the language of Psalm 22, how they part his garments among them using a very specific description in Psalm 22. That's enough to draw our attention. And by the way, the New Testament makes reference to Isaiah 53 in a number of different ways, clearly telling us it's messianic, clearly telling us to look at it, but it doesn't quote every key verse. He was wounded for our transgressions. It doesn't quote all of that relevant section there. It just quotes parts here and there. That happens with other Psalms as well, and other prophecies as well. That attention is drawn to the Psalm as a whole, or to the passage as a whole, or to the chapter as a whole. That's what the New Testament does. So Psalm 22 is clearly featured in the New Testament, and is definitely something that the eyes of the New Testament authors were on, and the early followers of Yeshua were certainly looking at, without question. So again, I'm surprised. I'm surprised by how this breaks down, but it gets much, much worse. And what troubles me is people will see Rabbi Singer's video or be in his audience and think that what he was saying was accurate, think that what he was saying was factual because he was so passionate about it. But as you're about to see in front of your eyes, friends, it completely breaks down. Clip number 4.
Every single Bible in the whole world says the same word in Hebrew. Not one Bible ever found says they pierced.
Oh, sorry. Squirming a little bit. Okay. He's saying every Hebrew text, every Hebrew Bible that's ever been found reads ka'ari, like a lion. None of them read ka'aru, which is taken to mean they pierced or they dug through, as a biform of karu. None of them say that. Rather, they all say ka'ari, like a lion. Not a single Hebrew manuscript, not a single Hebrew Bible in the entire world ever has read that way. Ever, ever, ever. None of them say this alleged ka'aru. None of them say karu. Okay. I guess Rabbi Singer is not familiar with the massive collocation of all Masoretic manuscripts done by two scholars separately a few centuries back, Kennicott and de Rossi. So these are books written in Latin that give every last Masoretic manuscript. And so you have to understand there are thousands of Masoretic manuscripts, and there are all kinds of variations. All right. So I copy this out. Okay. You can actually access the book in PDF form online. I copied this out. I magnified it. I underlined a few things. So I'm going to put it on the screen. If you're listening, I'll do my best to explain. But let's go to image 5, clip number 5. And, I'm sorry, first Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, that's the right image. Put that up. Number 5, put that back up. Okay, so first from Qumran Cave 4Q88, with further reference. This is a fragment from Psalm 22. Now, it has the letters for Hikifuni, and they are written with these little circles on top, meaning that the text is not 100% clear. All right. But then there's Kaf Resh, and then a Vav, Karu. All right. So the Vav is not certain, and then Yadai, Baraglai, so my hands and my feet. But notice there's no Aleph there. This text is from Hasmonean times, so this text is from well before the time of Jesus. All right. And it does not have the Aleph. And the most likely reading is karu, but certainly it does not have the aleph there, which would support the idea that the text originally said karu or ka'aru. And karu, as we'll show in a little while, can mean to dig through, to bore through. Hence can be used, obviously, to cut through, to bore through. Crucifixion would obviously work well with that concept. And then, although he tries to downplay this from Nachal Hever, so these texts were a little bit later. This would be from a century or so after Jesus, but many of these have been dated to well before Jesus. But either way, these are Jewish texts, okay? These are Jewish texts, Jewish collections. So there we have Ka'aru. You say, well, I think it's just a yud at the end. It's Ka'ari. The best Dead Sea Scroll scholars have examined this and looked at this. People who specialize in orthography, and they're not an axe to grind. They're just transcribing what it says, and they're all looking at the same pictures and then studying it in person, looking at it. Ka'aru is the best reading. All right. But what about the Masoretic manuscripts? Let's go to clip number 6 here, our 6th image. Let's look at this. And Kai, just leave this up for a little while. All right. So again, if you're listening on radio and you're not watching, I'm going to do my best to explain this to you. But what you have here is a series of numbers. And what it's telling you is, okay, in this particular manuscript, which scholars number as thus and such, number 4, 38, or 40, etc., that the main Masoretic text means one thing, but you have X number of manuscripts that read something different. So, for example, instead of Ka'ari, like a lion, you have one manuscript, number 245, that reads Ka'aryeh. These are Masoretic manuscripts, Masoretic Hebrew texts, late medieval and after, okay? So it's a more full spelling of lion, Ka'aryeh, instead of Ka'ari. But you have the text, and I underlined it, Ka'aru, Kaf, Aleph, Resh, Vav, which Rabbi Singer said does not exist in a single Masoretic text, Masoretic Bible, anywhere in the world. False, 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 false. How many times false? Well, here you have it. manuscript number 39, 267, 270, 277, and then 288 and 660, and then some other variations. Then you have some other marginal ones. So overall, you have it attested about 8 different times. You say, well, it's just 8. Hey, when someone says none exist, when someone says there's not a manuscript on the planet where this exists, and here, and any scholar knows the Kennecott collection, okay? DeRossi then just supplemented it with errors and with variations in the vowels as well. But any Hebrew scholar, biblical scholar, is familiar with this compilation. It is just a list of the Masoretic manuscripts, Masoretic Hebrew manuscripts. When Rabbi Singer says, never occurs, 0, no manuscripts, no Hebrew Bible, nowhere, and he's very dramatic about it. Well, you got at least 8 times. And then 4 or 5 times you have Karu. So this is a legitimate variant in these Masoretic manuscripts, Karu or Karu. Okay, so...
So let's also note one other passage that you might not be aware of because we don't talk about it as much. At least I haven't heard about it as much, but it's a verse from Zechariah 12:10. It says, "And I will pour out on the house of David," of course, Jesus is a descendant of David, "and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him, as one grieves for a firstborn son. On that day, the weeping in Jerusalem will be as great as the weeping of Hadid Ramin in the plain of Megiddo." So note that other passage we have. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to find another refutation, another place to refute from Dr. Brown. So stay tuned. Dr. Josh Bowen and I have gone back and forth numerous times discussing the dating of the book of Daniel. Many conservative Christians and scholars believe that the book of Daniel was written when Daniel said he wrote the book of Daniel, which is around 600 years prior to Jesus' coming on the earth. Now, Dr. Bowen makes the assertion that it's much later during the Maccabean period, but there are many arguments against that. One of the arguments is, of course, that the book of Daniel is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and there are just a couple of Greek words, which are musical instruments. Yet in that time, if it were written so much later in the 2nd century BC, we would have likely more Greek words. And that is just one of many arguments. But what Dr. Bowen does frequently is he refers to this particular scholar, Collins, and Dr. Brown is going to address the scholarship of Collins and also the dating. So let's take a look here.
So either way, we could argue about a nuance of this part or this part, but I can give you a legitimate explanation as to how each of these 6 points is fulfilled in what Yeshua does on the cross and what he ushers in and the transformation of life that he brings. And then the second temple is destroyed. There it is. There it is. And if not, put the Messiah out of this for a moment. How is it fulfilled? What does it mean? Now, Professor John Collins reflects a critical historical interpretation of the verse. And he says, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression. It means the idea is that evil must run its course until the appointed time to bring sins to completion. As in Daniel 8:23, where their meaning is that the sins will reach their full measure and to expiate iniquity. With God as subject, the root lechaper, with God as subject means to cancel or absolve. To bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal vision as authentic, and to anoint a most holy place. The references to the rededication of the Jerusalem temple, which was actually accomplished by Judas Maccabee late in 164 BCE. The only problem with that is to think that iniquity is expiated and everlasting righteousness brought in and prophecy and vision sealed and sin brought to its full measure when Judas Maccabee rededicates the temple in 164 BCE. How does that work? It doesn't work. So the critical historical interpretation falls short. The traditional Jewish interpretation leaves us in very vague, uncertain waters. But the Messianic interpretation, clear, powerful, and fits. And that's why without shame, we endorse it and hold to it. And frankly.
So you see what happened with Dr. Brown. He actually became a Christian many years ago, as I'd mentioned before. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to mention something that you might not be aware of. Some people aren't aware of another verse that can help celebrate Christmas season. And maybe you've heard it when you were young on Charlie Brown. So it says right here in Isaiah 9:6. Isaiah 9:6, where is that? Okay, so we have, for to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatest of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Almighty, Lord Almighty, will accomplish this. Amen. I hope you've enjoyed this video today. I hope that you'll like and subscribe and choose to come again. I also hope that you'll refer this to your friends. You can reach me at christian-apologist.com. You can also reach me at LEAD1225 on Twitter. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.